experience documentaries on both Carter, which was 2 parts, and Clinton, which was 4 parts. And I'm reminded of that. The Carter thing was uplifting. Maybe he was misunderstood as a president. Maybe he was ahead of his time. The Clinton, watching the 4 parts of the Clinton series reminded me, it took me right back to the 90s. I'm of age that I remember the 90s and Clinton's presidency much better than I remember Carter's. I was a little kid during Carter's presidency. And I just remembered, my goodness, we went from one crisis to another, to another, to another. And it even changed my revisionism of this, thinking I still had romanticized aspects of the Clinton presidency. And I came out of watching this PBS special thinking, gosh, Carter was actually a better president.
Well, I mean, history is, it's all relative, but, there will be Democrats, there will be a lot of Democrats that would disagree with, what we're saying. I mean, I am a Hillary Clinton supporter right now. I mean, I do think she will be president, but, there's, at the same time, do I miss the excesses of the Clinton presidency? Do I miss the feeling that whenever we're up, this feeling that, what is he going to do now? How is he going to screw this up? No, I don't. And one of the things that a lot of people liked about Obama was that he had this sort of moral, and I mean, yes, he was hubris to think that he could be president, any person is, but he had this sort of moral code that aligned him more with that Carter era than with the Clinton era. And with Clinton, he just oozes confidence, and he oozes personality, and he oozes charm. And if he was in this conversation right now with us, he'd be doing everything he could to try and convince us of his worth.
Right.
But at the same time, his flaws are just so striking. And a perfect example was his willingness to cave on welfare reform to Newt Gingrich and the Republicans to essentially solidify his reelection. That is something that I know for a fact Barack Obama would not do. And that's something that
and I should
Carter
say,
would have told Newt Gingrich to go to hell.
Right, exactly. And I think,
in short.
And I think a lot of our Florida governors would have too. Reuben Askew and Lawton Childs for sure. Bob Graham for sure. The thing about that is that as we get further away from the Clinton years and we talk about Clinton versus Carter and Obama in that mix, I hear a lot of Democrats saying, you know what, if he hadn't signed that bill, we might have taken back Congress. But that in that election, that was the first election after the Republicans had taken Congress, and there were a bunch of Republicans sitting in Democratic seats, and seats that the Democrats had held the previous 40 years or for the previous generation, but that essentially deprived us, and it's funny because this wasn't the analysis at the time in 1996, that essentially deprived us of the issue we could have run against on them. So even from a political perspective, it wasn't a good thing for Democrats. It was just a good thing for him.
And that's where you got a situation in 1996 where you had the lone landslide that they talk about, where the president won, by 8 o'clock when the polls closed, and the Democrats got clobbered almost everywhere.
Yeah, right.
Or they won re-election, or they lost seats that they should have.
It was one of the weirdest things. I was a student at the University of Florida at the time, and that was the night we lost the Florida House also. The Democrats lost control of the Florida House while Clinton was carrying the state by 6 points. And I walked into the newsroom I worked at UF, at WRUF the next morning, and the news director said, "Boy, you must be licking your wounds from last night. What a horrible night." When in fact, in reality, my president had been reelected, but we had lost every other election. It was we talk about the 1980 election, so we'll refocus on Jimmy Carter now. They talk about that being the coattail election where Reagan brought in all these Republicans. 96 was kind of the undoing of coattails as an electoral phenomenon.
I mean, the only instance, I think, out of all the elections that I have mentally been been I'd involved it because I think I started paying attention in 1992 because I'm just that big of a nerd. The only instance where there was such a thing as coattails, you could argue, was 2004 with Bush solidifying his hold over the U.S. Senate.
Yeah.
But really, 2008, when Barack Obama, anybody who was a Democrat in 2008, even if they lost less than what they would have. I mean, it was just, there were people that, you had a situation like with Boyd, my old congressman here, where in 2010, just 2 years later, he would lose by 7 points. In 2008, he ran unopposed. I mean, it was just a situation where Republicans were just getting clobbered everywhere. I mean, I think we actually did make some fairly good gains in House races then. Which, I mean, in hindsight, we talked about earlier. We talked about Ray Winkle Vasalinda. She won her first race in 2008 by about, I think, 150 votes. She was running against a Republican who I think was a former FSU quarterback. If he had run in 2010 or 2012 or 2014, you would have clobbered her.
Yep.
And it was only by virtue of the fact that she ran in 2008 with Obama. I mean, there wasn't a Democrat in sight who didn't have a good night there.
Yep, that was the coattail effect, much like 1980. Before we let you go, I've got to ask you about this piece of literature you have a photograph of in the book, which is the first Spanish language campaign, mass-produced campaign literature in a U.S. presidential campaign by Jimmy Carter in 1976. I did not realize, I was under the impression, and again, maybe this is dating me in my political involvement, I was under the impression when I got the Spanish language literature from Michael Dukakis in 1988, that was, here in South Florida, that was the first time it had been done. The Democrats made it sound like that, but it actually 1976, the Carter election.
Well, and I do feel bad for Dukakis because I feel as though I've removed one of the I think the 4 historical footnotes that poor man has. But no, it was Jimmy Carter. The first one, from what I hear, who sort of dabbled in it was George McGovern. He tried it out a little bit. He kind of beta tested it, but he really didn't do a whole lot because that man was just trying to stop the bleeding in 72. But the first individual who made a real conscious effort to get Latino support was Jimmy Carter, and he did do those pamphlets. He spent a lot of time trying to do that. He actually is pretty fluent in Spanish, and he's always been very fascinated with Latin America, and this was really all part of his effort, and which something he did once he was president to bring human rights and democracy to South America. And he was the first one, and Democrats nowadays, they owe a lot of the current support that they enjoy from Latin Americans to the efforts of Carter and Mondale, because this is where it all started.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, we could go on all night, but Powell mentions that in his autobiography when they went to Haiti, that there was a respect for Carter. Those members of the Haitian junta, they didn't have the same respect for the president they were representing, President Clinton, as they did for President Carter. Now, they probably had more respect for President Clinton than they did for President Reagan or President Nixon. I'm almost positive of that. But Carter was held up in the Caribbean and Latin America as this one American head of state that had been a champion. I think maybe John Kennedy was as well, but post Kennedy, that was a champion of a good neighbor policy, human rights, humanity, those sorts of things. Thank you so much for the time. We're going to do a lot more on the book this week at the website, and just give a plug about this book and your previous book, the Florida Governor's book, and talk a little bit maybe even about your coming book on Governor Dan McCarty.
Fantastic. Now, before I go, there is one point that we haven't touched on that I do think is very important that I would like to talk about.
Go ahead.
And that is the photos of Charles Plant that Charles Plant produced for this book. There are photos in this that were done during the election night and election morning in Plains. Charles Plant was the only one that was given access to the train depot, which was where all of the celebrations took place.
Let me ask you, actually, that raises another question, and continue with that in a minute. So the victory party was in Atlanta, correct? And he came back to Plains that night?
Yeah, well, this is something that sort of took place, and that seems to only be really with the Carter campaign, was that they had a whole bunch of activities at the hometown in Plains. So the hometown in Plains was having mass parties and all of this stuff. They were having potlucks and they were getting drunk and they had these big TVs and everything. And then over in Atlanta, which is where the actual campaign apparatus took place, they were having a celebration, this huge event at the World Congress Center, which was open for free to any Georgians. And they ended up closing the doors because they had 28,000 people there at around 8 o'clock when the polls closed. By the time Jimmy Carter went over the top when he won Mississippi at 3 a.m., there were only 5,000 people still there. It was a very, very long night. He went downstairs. He greeted the supporters in Atlanta, thanked them. That was around 4 o'clock. He immediately got his motorcade ready, which, motorcades take a while, folks. He flew back to Sumter County, to Americus. At around 6 o'clock, he started his way to Plains. At about 6:30, he came to Plains as the sun was coming up, and there were all of these people, hundreds, that packed this small town waiting for him. And everybody in these photos that you'll see, and that was the point I was going to make, these are the only photos in existence of Jimmy Carter coming back as President-elect of the United States to Plains.
My goodness.
And Jimmy Carter is crying. Rosalind is crying. People are crying. Everybody's exhausted. Nobody has slept. And the sun is coming up on Plains. It was this beautiful pinkish pinkish orange morning, and it's casting this warm glow over everybody on the platform. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful moment in American history. And it's all thanks to Charles Plant that we have these images, because nobody else was allowed to really capture them this close to the candidate. And honestly, it is the professional thrill of my lifetime that I've been allowed to have these images in my book.
Well, thank you so much. It's really amazing when you look at those images in particular. I mean, the whole book is amazing, but that is something you will not find anywhere else. And thank you for taking us through the narrative of that night, because I've always been confused about that. Or I should say, I was confused about that after looking at the book. I'd always assumed President Carter, or President-elect Carter, was in Atlanta that night, and didn't know the backstory from coming back to Plains, having one person who had access. It's much how you would picture, I know we've seen this immortalized in films, how it was when Harry Truman went back to independence after he left the White House. It reminded me of that. It sent chills up my spine in a good way, the same way seeing Truman after he had been rejected by the country, going back to independence and just being beloved by his hometown. In this case, Carter had just been elected, but the